So it's been 9 years since Four Lions, and I know you did some episodes of Veep, but have you got another career that we don't know about?
This film took a lot of work actually because it involved a lot of research, going and meeting people who work for the FBI, for the DOJ, and a lot of families of people who'd been sent to jail on these kind of stings. So by the time you add all that up, all the travel, all the work it takes to kind of go to places that you've never been before, where you need somebody to vouch for you. If you go into the middle of Detroit not knowing what you're doing, then things can get a bit sticky. In fact, most of these stings happen in the poor parts of town, so it took quite a lot of arranging, then writing, then you have to get the money together to make the thing and cast. So by the time you've done all that and had a couple of cups of tea, it adds up.
How many years is that then?
About 5.
That's long. I did think many times during the film that I was laughing at something that I shouldn't have been laughing at. Is that a common reaction?
Well, the story is, I mean, I think the reason, well, how would I take that? The story in itself is surprising. I was surprised when I hit this story. It hit me like a sort of brick hurled from Miami into the middle of London. I was in London watching the TV news, and there was a story that the FBI had arrested this army based in a warehouse in Miami who were planning a full-scale ground war against the United States. 2 years later, I was in the States, and somebody who was involved in that trial said, "Do you remember that thing about a full-scale ground war? That turned out to be 7 construction workers who had this mad idea they were going to take over the United States by riding into Chicago on horses." Now, what had happened was that they'd basically been impoverished working in Miami. They didn't have any guns, they didn't have the money to get to Chicago, let alone any horses. They didn't even have a goat. But they'd fallen in with an FBI informant who'd offered them a lot of money to come up with a plan against the government. Their first plan? To lead a protest to the governor's house about conditions in the projects. And the informant said, "Well, you're not going to get the money if you do that. Come on, you think of something else." And they riffed until they came up with this nutty idea to knock over the Sears Tower, swamp Chicago in a tidal wave, and then when the water subsided, then they would ride in on horses, take over the city, because they said people respect a man on a horse. And by the time I found that out, I thought, yeah, this is a farcical but sort of terrible situation. It's basically supercharged entrapment, where the FBI lures a suspect along a program of self-incrimination that's written like a script, complete with a Hollywood ending, in which the suspect is arrested and sent to jail. So the FBI kind of comes up with a terrorist plot, gets someone to carry it out, and then sends them to jail for that.
So I'm assuming this bunch all got sent to
They
jail.
all went to jail. They all went to jail, yeah. It took 3 trials, that one. But I thought it was a one-off. It turns out it's a repeat practice. It's basically the MO for the FBI. They identify somebody who they don't like the look of. They send in some informants who are often criminals working off charges and are certainly being paid to mine this for the best results for the FBI. So they lead that suspect along a line of carefully prepared traps which are being set up by the Department of Justice. And when the suspect has incriminated themselves enough, bang, that's it. And off they go to jail. And this isn't contested. I mean, it's ridiculous, which is why I've made a comedy about it, but it's not even contested. I spoke to somebody at the Department of Justice about their 99% conviction rate, and he said to me, "I know, it's terrible, it should be 100%.
My God. The film's based on, you say, 100 true stories. How did you go about finding all these people?
Well, as I say, the first story I encountered was the one where the biggest plot since 9/11 turned out to be 7 builders riding into Chicago on horses. These guys weren't Al-Qaeda. They were Haitian Catholics, but they went to jail as Al-Qaeda terrorists. And when I discovered that that was a repeat pattern, I thought, this is a subject, it's basically, this demands to be satirized. It's got to be a comedy about injustice. Because in real life, the situation is farcical enough that it seems to be crying out. In fact, I couldn't believe there wasn't a stampede of people charging on the same route as I was to make this story. Because everywhere you go, you see the patterns the same and just the details are different. Because the FBI can get away with offering money, sometimes up to $250,000. There was a case in New York where they had to offer these guys $250,000 before they agreed to do anything. Even then, they wanted their bomb to go off at night so no one got hurt. That's what they said. But in the trial, they all went to jail. even though the judge said in summing up that none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for the work of the government. So there's a kind of tacit acknowledgement that these things were pushed and distorted, and that's where the comedy comes from. But the fact that they go through to completion means that it's a comedy with consequences.
And the police don't come out of this well either, do they? They're sort of trigger-happy bozos.
The funny thing about the police is that they are as critical of the FBI as this film is, whilst at the same time doing exactly the same thing. But if you say to the police department, what about these FBI sting operations? They go, I know, the FBI, they're idiots, this is appalling. At the same time as their own department is probably carrying out the same kind of thing. So you have this classic sort of interagency rivalry, which, you know, I think is time old. The police have always been rather wary of the FBI. But after 9/11, nobody really knew how to catch a terrorist. So everybody ended up accidentally evolving a system whereby they made their own. And it is easier, it's harder to catch a real terrorist than it is to manufacture your own. And they sort of, all agencies accidentally discovered that.
So did you have to track down sort of disenchanted FBI, former agents or anything to get, the inside track on what they were doing?
The strange thing about this is that people in the FBI, whether they're still working for the FBI or now no longer working for the FBI, think that it is in some way ridiculous. But if you're on one of these jobs, it's your job to bring in this case, then unless you're extremely brave, you won't stick your neck out and start questioning the premises. You will say, it's my job to take this to completion. And that's what Kendra, played by Anna Kendrick, does in the film. She sees this as a career opportunity. She sees how she can make it work. And there aren't really any questions going on in her head at the point where she takes it on. She also knows that this case will play very well with her boss, who's just messed up the previous case and needs a good result before he retires. So I wanted to show the kind of career pressures that put people on the course to this form of entrapment. And I've seen FBI agents testifying in court, and you suddenly realise that if you've put 18 months of work into one of these cases, you're not just going to let the person walk off the pitch halfway through. You're going to see this through until they're in jail. And there are cases where recordings have come up and they've had to be used or offered to the court where an FBI agent has accidentally left their microphone on and then gone back to FBI headquarters and reported on the suspect that they're winding up and saying, this guy's an idiot, we don't even have to offer him money, we can get him to do anything. And one person at the table goes, should we be wasting our resources on this kind of person? There's a bit of a silence, and then somebody says, we're not wasting our resources, this is good. And that's the end of the question. Now, if you're that FBI person raising the question that way, everyone might look at you a bit, but you've put everything back in the box. If, as some of the people I spoke to have protested to the point where they say this is out of order, you're likely to get frozen out.
It is extraordinary the lengths they go to just have people shot just to avoid embarrassment for the agency. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Most of the things that happen in the film are variants or distortions on ideas that came up during the research. So there is one case where this sort of sting has gone through to somebody getting shot, only one. So the threat is often there because you've got highly trained armed law officers. But what they tend to do is end up destroying the world. The person who's the suspect lives in a kind of Truman Show reality. So in the film, Moses is this preacher who's struggling to make ends meet in the projects in Miami. He's running a family mission with no money, hardly any food. He's about to be thrown out, and one day, for reasons he can't quite put his finger on, his fortunes change, and an international businessman offers him some money and some guns. Now, he's banned guns from his mission, but he's being offered $50,000, so he thinks he can play this guy. What he doesn't know is that the FBI are behind this offer, and if he accepts it, he's going to go to jail. So he, at that point, steps into a sort of Truman Show reality where the rules are being played by the gods of the Department of Justice and the FBI, and he is their pawn. So it becomes a sort of cat and mouse game where the mouse doesn't even know the cat exists. And that is the anatomy of these cases time and time again.
It's amazing. How did you find your Moses, Marchand Davis? Hadn't he just graduated?
Yeah, I mean, we had some brilliant casting people in New York, Doug Abel and Associates, and they kept offering people who, actually quite a lot of people had just come out of acting school. I made it a rule that I'd see everybody, and so everybody in the film, you know, came in, and you'd sort of have an audition, but you kind of play around too. And I think in Marchand's first audition, he did actually sit on the table. So we did the scene where he's sitting on the table in the hotel room, sort of behaving like a sultan. And he carried it off with the perfect measure of aplomb and doubt, because I wanted his thoughts to be available through his sort of stylistic presentation. And he was great, and we talked about it, and then the gods seemed to be on our side. I had this idea that maybe Moses would have a horse, and I said to Marchand, look, is there any way, you can't ride a horse, can you? And he said, yeah, I can ride. I used to be a groom. When I was a kid, I groomed horses. And I said, okay, brilliant. And can you imagine, he comes from Philadelphia, Northwest Philadelphia. I said, can you ever imagine a black guy riding through town on a horse? Because I'm thinking that for Moses. And he said, there's a guy that does that in dreadlocks, rides through rush hour traffic in Philadelphia near where I live. So I just thought, all right, we're going to keep going with this. I mean, I didn't cast him because he could talk about horses, but he was brilliant, and then some. And everything just seemed to fall into place.
I love Davis. He said he only saw your stuff after he'd been cast, and his reaction was, oh shit.
Well, that's the advantage of working in America, that basically it's a clean slate. Because when I was working on Four Lions, the guy who played Adil, who gets blown up on a sheep, didn't stop being paranoid that something amiss was. He didn't stop being paranoid that he was being wound up. The whole thing was wound up until after we'd stopped filming. That was an extreme example. But no, I have to say, if Marchand thought that, he hit it pretty well.
And he called you a wonderfully exciting mad scientist. Is that a fair description, do you think?
I probably explain things at speed and the trouble is, if you use the English language as you do in England, in America, you automatically sound like fruity. So I think it was a source of great amusement to him and the other guys in the cast to hear me explaining things in the way I would, and they would just fasten onto expressions and words. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure they just thought I was a sort of frothing tablet of nonsense.
And he was cast without even seeing a script. Is that the case for the other cast members as well? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because I didn't want the story going out there in such a way that somebody might, when we were trying to film in a particular location, create an inconvenience for us. So I was quite cautious about that. Also, the script was still being written, and I think it's better to discuss it. You can then you can put it in succinct terms, because the scripts I tend to write with Jesse are pretty verbal, and they're quite, you have to sort of crunch through them. It's easier if somebody tells you in 5 seconds what it's about.
And you end up with all these genius ideas like painting the Santas black and all of it. Just
you see,
excellent ideas.
Painting the Santa black. I said to Marchand, one of your icons, so his icons that he has in his mission are Jesus, Muhammad, Melchizedek, the first priest to break bread, and they include General Toussaint, who was the only successful slave rebel who took over Haiti, and Black Santa, because Black Santa is an icon that you bump into certainly in places like Little Haiti, which is near where this is set in Miami. And I mentioned this to Marchand. He said, Chris, when I was 5, my mum came home with a white Santa and said, kids, your job is to take this into the yard now and paint him black. So I just thought, okay, let's get a Santa and put him in. It's just a background thing, but it's just part of the sort of world of Moses. And I think that's how I got to make the film, was by constantly hearing things from the environments I went into, including the actors' lives, because I'm investigating a lie. I'm investigating something that was presented to me as truth on the news, and I subsequently find out to be false. And then I'm building a world of information within which to come up with a story. So anything like that, any understanding that any of the cast give me from their lives, their worlds, is extremely informative and helpful, and helps take the film more into reality, which gives us a right to make jokes.
Exactly. How the hell do you keep your project secret? Simon Blackwell said he thought you had an elite troupe of killers who just go around murdering anyone who might say anything.
It's often practical, and people sort of understand. So with Four Lions, we were very worried. It's worth keeping the project secret because it's so easy to disrupt a film set. With Four Lions, we were filming in Sheffield, and quite aware that if someone had wanted to, all they had to do was come along with an air horn and keep firing it, and you know, you pretty much have to wrap up the day's shooting, and you were always on a tight budget trying to maximise your time. So it's really dull practical considerations like that as much as the skullduggery of secrecy, but it helps to give you space to manoeuvre so that you can kind of work without external considerations having to be nodded to, because they can just distort. What you want when you make a film is a kind of private play space where everyone can let rip, and then you kind of work it into what it's meant to be. And actually filming in the Dominican Republic gave us that. It gave us sort of secrecy that we hadn't requested. Nobody knew where we were.
And also it must help with concentration if you haven't got people tweeting all the time where they are and what they're doing. You know, they've got to focus and just...
Yeah, I know people who sort of hit a button which unleashes an E-bomb to destroy all mobile networks during their meetings. We didn't have to do that, but yes, I think people, nobody really came in with their phone. I think there was too much of a sense of not enough time to get all this done. Everyone was quite on their mettle. They had to do a lot, had to learn to walk like animals, had to sing and chant and clap and behave like the farmers that we see on the film. And the FBI people had to sort of learn what it was to be in the FBI, how to walk with a gun. So we had FBI agents on set, or ex-FBI agents, telling us how to do all of that. I don't think anyone had time.
And had you hoped to shoot it in Miami? Would it just be politically too difficult?
Filming in Miami is impossible because of the Koch brothers, who destroyed the tax break. Well done, guys. Basically, they make it impossible. You know, if you're going to film somewhere, you sort of rely on a tax break to help your money go a bit further. It would have been nice to film in Miami, but we ended up filming in the Dominican Republic, which you can make look like I think that the boundaries are seamless, the joins are seamless. So yeah, I mean, it wasn't, you film wherever works.
This deals with this, and in fact everything else deals with subjects that other people would run away screaming from. I mean, the word incendiary springs to mind. Where did that kind of envelope pushing come from?
The thing about doing any project is that you fasten onto an idea because it's interesting, and it's normally interesting because it deals with some sort of friction between how you think things should be and how they are. And that friction is often in an area where authority is being carried out in a way that perhaps it shouldn't. So there's not even a question about rubbing people up the wrong way, because in a way that's possibly the reason you got there. The reason you got there is made out of the sort of question that you want to pin down. So it's just, if you see a farcical injustice which is sort of demanding to be satirised, it would be a bit odd to ignore it. So it never really comes up as even a question to me. It's just, is this interesting? Oh yes, it's interesting, let's do it. And then anything that gets in your way is an obstacle.
And it genuinely results in something that no one's seen before, which is a joy.
It's a bit odd because all of this is on the public record. I say it's based on 100 true stories. There's nearly 400 of these, and they've been written about, but I just don't think it quite fits a paradigm that people are prepared to entertain readily, because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, the FBI set people up. But when you find yourself saying that most terrorism cases in the United States are in fact built by the FBI, that's something that people struggle to take on board. But the story of Moses in the film demonstrates the rather strange truth that the outfit responsible for most terror plots in the US is the FBI. And that's not some mad claim, that's on the public record. And if you then say, well, it's a case of entrapment that works, it's supercharged entrapment, which to you and I looks farcical, but it works, so nobody's going to change it. It becomes quite difficult to swallow if you think, oh, you know, things are basically sort of okay in the way the government works, and then there's just a few problems that need dealing with. This is kind of quite institutionally problematic. But it's been written about. There's a lot of people out there saying it. In fact, most revealingly, there are people inside the FBI who say this.
Just not, no one's made a comedy about it, though. It's a different
No,
approach.
well, it is a comedy because it's so distorted. I mean, once people are making things up, I mean, if you say, look, how do you catch a terrorist? I can't catch a real one, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose an eccentric person who's poor, and I'm going to construct a Hollywood script and then get them to follow it without knowing that's what they're doing. And I'm going to use them with false friends. I'm going to entice them with false friends, with money and anything else I can think of. And as long as the attorney at my shoulder says this plays, it plays, and we'll get them into jail as a convicted terrorist. Well, I mean, that is ludicrous. But that just happens to be how it works. How could that not at some level be comic?
Brilliant. Your work has influenced a whole generation of writers and performers. I mean, everyone from Sacha Baron Cohen. I was just reading the Onion website, and there were things that felt as if they could be from the day to day. How do you feel about that?
I don't really. I don't really think about that at all. I mean, you can't track it's hard enough to track your own thoughts when they're inside your head. But once they're in other people's heads, that's really hard, and it's a bit of a waste of time. It's great if people say that, but you can't really go around thinking like that. Or if you do, you'll end up mad, I think.
What do you think of the current state of satire? I'm thinking compared with On the Hour or The Day to Day, everything feels a bit toothless these days, I would say.
People say now that satire is difficult because of the absurdity of the current situation, but I mean, that's a contradiction, isn't it? If the situation is absurd, then it's more readily satirised. The problem is that people feel uncertain now because of the destabilisation of a consensus, but that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean you can't make jokes. It may mean that when you go to bed at night, you feel a bit more worried about the joke that was made because you're not comfortable. But choppy waters, I mean, it's just, if people are doing something ridiculous, the idea that satire can't be done anymore is as ludicrous as suggesting that people have started behaving sensibly.
I think the news at the moment does sound like you and Armando Iannucci just made it up.
Well, we did a satire about the manners of news, and now news is no longer respected in the way it was when we did that. So there's a simple irrelevance, even though there may be a nostalgic glow around the time when a newscaster used to, without irony, talk about using the voice of God when they spoke. And that just doesn't happen anymore. News has much less authority, therefore it's not crying out to be punctured. So you do what you do in the time that you're alive and things move on.
Do you reckon that shows that those kind of satire comedy shows that have political guests on can launder their images? I'm thinking of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, on Have I Got News for You? They come out as these rather cuddly characters. What do you think?
I can't be asked. I sort of think, really, honestly, I think about the work that I'm doing, and I think, I'm more interested in things like discovering that an appeal lawyer may get one of these terrorism cases overturned than, you know, the social value of booking guests on TV shows. That's not really very high. That's kind of below the number of oat flakes in my muesli as a sort of matter of deep personal interest. That's if I eat muesli, which I don't, so that's even lower than you'd imagine if I were a muesli eater. So no, I don't really, I tend to work on what I'm working on.
Okay. I saw Richard Ayoade the other day, and he said that the best thing he'd ever done in his career was the thing that you did with him and Noel Fielding.
Yeah.
He's still talking about it now. Will that ever... It was radio, wasn't it?
We made some recordings.
Will that ever see the light of day?
Does radio ever see the light of day? Or does it sneak out in the dark of night? It might do. It's a matter of... it's a long edit. It'll be a comfortable retirement job, which I'll give to Richard to do.
Right. Well, he would be delighted, I tell you. He was
Yeah.
very excited about it. And what about your side of performing? Do you ever have any desire to be back on the other side of the camera, or are you happy as you are?
I don't think of it that way. It's just that if you're making a film about a preacher in Miami who's black and aged late 20s, the idea of you performing that role shouldn't even occur to you. So it's not a case of I've stopped performing. It's just a case of, does it occur to you? But I started in radio where you sort of say and do everything, and you gradually develop a saner and more rational approach as you go on, hopefully.
And people really appreciate when you do pop up, have a little cameo with a Stuart Lee thing or something.
Well, you just do what you do.
Are you allowed to say anything about what you're doing next, or have you not even thought about that yet?
Am I able to say? And I don't mean able as in I'm not being allowed by other agencies, unless I'm several agencies. Maybe one of those agencies is not permitting me to say what it is, but I wouldn't know if that were the case.
The elite troop of killers may come out and kill me.
There aren't any of those. You don't need those. People are mortal enough anyway.
Can I go slightly off piste again? Is there an unsung hero? Sorry, I have to ask everyone this. Is there an unsung hero who's helped you through your career but never got the recognition that they deserve?
Whoa, that's like a read out question. Well, if you look at this film, on the surface, it's made by a much smaller bunch of people than actually made it. If you look at the credits, mind you, you'll see a longer list of names. And it would be slightly too lovey to say that every one of them is an unsung hero. But the truth is that when you're making things, you're always relying on luck. You're relying on other people's insight, diligence, talent. So it varies. I think you need to be constantly in the company of heroes, some of whom sing their own praises very loudly and others not at all. So really, that sort of constellation is what constitutes the unsung heroes in any sequence of work, I would say.
One thing I forgot to ask about the film, the characters in the film. Are those jail sentences sort of correct? Do people really get sent to jail in these kind of cases for 35 years?
Yeah, you can go and... So, the sentences at the end of the film... Actually, no, that's giving it away. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to cut that off. But I'm going to say that in real life, people do go down for 25, 30, 35 years. And the reason is because the Department of Justice is extremely good at terrifying juries. So if the case ever does get to court, the jury is bound to convict. The basic method is they say, we wound this person up to this point, and then they tried to do this. And if they'd succeeded, this is what would have happened. And they show film of a massive explosion. And then they get in an expert to say, these people are the most dangerous people on the planet. And then they turn to the jury and say, should these people go to the jail? And the jury convict them. And the sentences are harsh because it's terrorism. What you don't hear is that in some of the most ridiculous cases, the sentences are quietly eroded, and then these people who at the time they were convicted were labelled as the most dangerous terrorists in the country are let out of jail quietly because the system knows that this is an injustice, that this is a farce. And then those people are released on probation and then have to try and get work with convicted terrorists on their CV. So, yeah, those sentences are what you see in real life.
And the FBI do have quotas and performance targets, is that right?
Well, after 9/11, the FBI said, we're not going to let that happen again. And they built 56 terrorism task force centres across the States. Now, if you spent that amount of money, then you need to tell yourself that it's worth it. So you don't need to have a set quota in a box-ticking kind of way. You just have a psychological condition that says, if you're reporting to your boss at the end of the year and you say, we've kept this area safe, we kept the city safe, it's going to look more convincing if there are some people in jail as a result of that safety mission than no one in jail. So it sort of produces its own results. Also, you've put in a huge amount of resources into finding something. And once you're doing that, as one FBI agent told me, you're going to find it whether it's there or not. So if you spend $1 million looking at this part of a city because it fits the profile, it's got Muslims, it's got a black population, some of whom are anti-government, whatever your reason, and you put $1 million into finding a terrorist there, then by the end of 2 years you will have found a terrorist whether there was one there or not, because it's just it's an algorithm. And if your $1 million tells you there is one there, so every time you get the chance to go yes rather than no, you go yes. And again, that's what feeds into the farce of the real life situations, and that's what gives you the comedy of the film.
It's terrifying. It reminds me a little bit of the hostile environment policy over here, that you've got a quote, you've got to get that number of people out of the country, that injustice will prevail. So,
well, every country does it slightly differently, and entrapment has never played as a defence in the United States, no matter how distorted the case is, no matter how much money has been used to get these people to do what they do. Here, you have to go about it a slightly different way.
I think I'm being wound up, aren't I? Or are you just poking me?
So,
Yeah.
it's me, Andy.
Okay.
Thank you
Good.
so much.